So today I'd like to talk a little bit about the weekly assignment. How does X text help you understand Y text? To start this off and tell a little story about me. I used to be really good at trivia games, Trivia Pursuit, and everybody always wanted me on their team. I'm not as good at that game anymore. I have problems reaching back in memory and finding those trivial bits of information that have no meaning or no use. Part of that, a big part of it, has to do with age. As you get older, your memory starts to get slower. Right? But there's a compensation for that, which is as you get older, you start to get better at recognizing patterns. Now for me, that's been a real blessing because doing academic work, doing scholarship, is all about recognizing patterns. And in fact, most of my PhD program was training in recognizing patterns and then explaining what I recognized. To a large extent, we could break down academic writing to that very thing, recognizing patterns and explaining what you've seen. That's a big part of this particular assignment, is learning how to do that. Now, I admit I'm often not very good at understanding what's difficult for students, and part of that has to do with the fact that some of these things, I've been doing them for so long and practicing them for so long, they seem self-evident to me. So sometimes I need to step back and think about people who haven't had the same experiences I have, what this means for them. So basically what I'm asking you to do is look for a pattern in one text and see what it tells you about a pattern in the other text. Because if you start looking for these in one text, you're going to start noticing patterns that move across texts. Okay? And while these texts have been selected because they do have something in common, what they have in common is not going to be too obvious. Okay. So, I've been getting a lot of comparison and contrast, a lot of summaries with some judgments. Some of those have been very good. But I still want to see this idea of how does one text help me understand the other text, right? Now, some assumptions that you might make, that for instance you have to agree with the first text, are erroneous. It's one of the hallmarks of academic writing that we use one text in some way, shape, or form, even if we thoroughly disagree with the text. It's actually quite common. You will see academic writing that has distinct markers that tell you the writer agrees with the text they're quoting. And then you will see some that have distinct markers that show you the writer disagrees. And then often you'll have you'll have writing that has no markers for agreement or disagreement. Those are the ones you have to be careful about. So let's go back and let's talk about this. And let me give you some examples of sorts of things you could do. And we'll use Sirc and Thonney because that's probably still very, very much in your minds. So what sorts of things can we find in Sirc that will help us understand Thonney? Well, first of all, we have to ask ourselves, what do we understand about Thonney? For instance, we know that she is concerned with teaching a certain set of practices that she says cut across all disciplines. Now, we might agree or disagree with that. For instance, the one that a writer announces their pattern is one that I don't always agree with. And I see a lot of writing that does do that, and I see a lot of writing that does not do that. But that's not the point. The point is, now, if I've got this idea at Shoney that she's concerned with patterns, what do I see that's Sirc that helps her understand that? Well, it's obvious he's not interested in patterns at all. I mean, conventions, right, at all. In fact, he's against conventions. So then we can ask ourselves, the whys and wherefores. Why is he against conventions, and why is she for conventions, right? And then we can start thinking about that. If we decided that she's all about the rules, which I think is a pretty strong interpretation of Thonney and probably not entirely fair to her, but we can do that. I've been unfair before in my writing. Then we can look at Sirc and see that he's against the rules, and then we can apply that pattern. On the other side, one of the things that Sirc is very interested in is student response to academic writing, which doesn't show up in Thonney at all. So we could talk about that. If students are resistant to academic writing, certainly that last essay, or that last section of the essay where Sirc brings in that writing from Bartholomew, strongly suggests that, and then we might ask ourselves to what extent students are going to simply acquiesce to those. We got a lot in discussion last Tuesday about assimilation, right? And we could look at that, but if we do that, if we wanted to look at assimilation, that somehow Thonney is a set of patterns because they ignore how assuming these moves might affect students, that their de facto assimilation. But then we've got to look at Sirc, because the assignment is how does Sirc help you understand that, and see if Sirc does have something that helps us understand the assimilation factor in Thonney. Now I realize this is that particular move would be easier if you didn't have to bring Sirc in at all, and it would be a perfectly good reading of Thonney. So why am I asking you to do it this way? Well, you might think about, say, the difference between me asking you to write poetry, where this class is a class on poetry, in blank verse, and writing an Elizabethan sonnet. One is much easier than the other. One you may have already had experience with than the other. But if you can master an Elizabethan sonnet, you can master blank verse. And that's the idea here. If you can master this exercise, you can do some of those easier things without a problem. And I should also add to that, because we're talking a lot about conversation in this class, that the most interesting conversations that take place in academic writing, because we're making the argument that that's what's happening in these texts, are not conversations between the writer and a single source, but they're conversations between several different writers, right? Some of who are sourced in the text, and some of them who are writing the text. So one of the big differences between this idea of how does X help you understand Y is that suddenly you've got a three-way conversation. If you just write about Sirc and then you just write about Thonney, you've got two conversations going on. But when you do this, then you've got a three-way conversation going on. It's going to be more complex, more difficult to write, but also it's going to provide more insight for you as a writer and hopefully for your reader.